Morning, True. I'll get and thanks, Jay, for that introduction. We're really pleased to be here. We'll be more pleased when we can be all together again. I am the director of the Australia Pacific Security College, and I'd really like to express my appreciation to all who've taken the time to attend today, especially those senior officials who will be attending the Joint Heads of Pacific Security meeting, but also the board members of our college who help us set our own directions, senior officials, and even the chiefs from police, customs, defense, immigration services from around the region. So we're really quite privileged to have this audience with us, but also you all inputting into the JHOPS, the Joint Heads of Pacific Security meeting, and shaping the kind of discussions and issues that will be had. It's clear going into the next year that our security environment's going to change with the opening of borders and the increased flow of goods and people across borders. I've worked on Pacific development and security issues for several decades now. One of the key approaches we've often taken is to look at recent trends to help shape what we should be planning for the future. With travel disrupted and trade disrupted over the last year, that means no doubt there are going to be surprises and even new systems and relationships coming into play. Some of those will be excellent. There'll be institutions, legal, and some will be pretty unexpected and may not be the kind of relationships or systems that we want. So while we look forward to the increased freedoms or a return to our freedoms and meeting face to face and reestablishing relationships, the opening of borders, of course, comes with risks. And that's what this webinar is about. The opening borders, sharing or looking at the risks and collective solutions. What we really want to get to in this workshop and using the collective insights of everybody is collective solutions that are practical, realistic, and can be implemented. The Pacific Island Forum leaders, when they met last August, really endorsed as part of their agenda, they had several topics, but one was to endorse the streamlining of collective responses to COVID-19 and to start looking at how we have harmonized approaches when we resume travel and economic activity. The leaders recognized the crucial role of the Pacific humanitarian pathway on COVID-19 in responding to the pandemic, but also its potential value for supporting the safe opening of borders. That is through stronger collaboration, strengthened local systems, and enhanced resilience. So it's really a time, this webinar, to think about those new relationships and systems that have emerged and how we make the most of them. And so when we open borders, we don't open opportunities for illegal movement of people and goods that are harmful to our society. The pandemic certainly impacted all of the Pacific communities, particularly those that were reliant on travel, tourism, but also economic impacts of those businesses that needed imports or were exporting. So it's affected our jobs, our cost of living, and our relationships, as well as access to essential goods and services. So there's significant opportunities as we reopen, but there's those risks. And so this webinar is to stimulate discussions about those practical approaches to dealing with those risks and to strengthen elements that are really particular to the Blue Pacific and to take some advantage of those strengths that we have here. In particular, today we'll be looking at the Pacific humanitarian pathway for COVID-19, the lessons we can learn from that for the future, but also ways in which we're going to deal with risks by disrupting criminal movements and human trafficking, and also minimizing the counterfeit and illicit goods movement that may come with the opening of borders. The insights that are gained from this workshop will feed directly into the Joint Heads of Pacific Security meeting. That's an annual meeting that happens each year with leaders in the security forces that think about the challenges ahead and agree on priorities and how to strengthen collaboration in the future. Before beginning, I would like to acknowledge the Australian Department of Defence for providing this opportunity again for the college to hold a pre-event webinar. And I also want to thank our case study presenters. We have some excellent expertise, and I'll be introducing them to you just before their presentations. The idea today is to shape future generations. To begin, it's our great honor to have Fiji's Major General, Johnny Kalunawai, to open up. He is, of course, the newly appointed head of the Royal Fijian Military Force, has also served as the Director General for Fiji's National Security and Defense Council Secretariat. But very importantly, he has a depth of experience, not only in Fiji, but also abroad, and has certainly provided strong leadership on thinking about the expanded security vision for Fiji, for the region, and the importance of collaboration and coordination across all sectors. So he's going to offer some words just to set the scene. This is a pre-recorded message for us because of some competing local priorities. But the Major General will have access to this recording and also will be attending the Joint Heads of Pacific meeting. So we'll begin with his recorded video message.
The Director of the Australia Pacific Security College, Professor Meg Keane, distinguished participants of the Joint Heads of Pacific Security event webinar, Opening Borders, Shared Risk, Collective Solutions. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Minister for Defense and National Security and Policing, a very good morning and bula vinaka to you all. First and foremost, I'd like to welcome you all to the Joint Heads of Pacific Security pre-event webinar with the theme of Opening Borders, Shared Risk, Collective Solutions. I acknowledge your presence this morning and am indeed grateful for availing yourselves to be a part of this discussion. I would like to take this opportunity to also acknowledge the host of this workshop, the Government of Australia, through the Department of Defence, and I extend our heartfelt thanks and appreciation to them. I would also like to thank the representatives of the various governments and agencies who have taken time from their busy schedules to be a part of this program. We hope that we will all strive towards attaining and learning more during these discussions. Ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a pleasure to be with you this morning to officiate the opening of the Joint Heads of Pacific Security pre-event webinar with the theme of Opening Borders, Shared Risk, and Collective Solutions. Over the last 24 months, there has been no other greater global security threat than COVID-19. Whilst other security threats have surfaced during this time period, their effect and impact has either been local or regional. COVID-19 has had a global impact and has shown that its impact goes beyond the borders of race, gender, age, income status, or nationality. So as many countries were battling the devastating impact of COVID-19, conversations were also being had on how the economic recovery from COVID-19 would look like, given that not only was COVID-19 a global health disaster, it was also a global economic disaster. As such, the recovery, which depends entirely on curbing and controlling the initial and underlying health risks, needs to innovate enough to be inclusive, resilient, and sustainable. Thus, when addressing these rehabilitation and recovery issues, a nation needs to, 1, mobilize the entire government machinery to have a whole of government and ultimately a whole of nation approach to the rehabilitation and recovery efforts. 2, analyze the national, regional, and global environment to ascertain the security threats that may arise from COVID-19 and how best to allocate resources to combat and ultimately defeat these security threats. And 3, ensure long-lasting recovery through establishing new or strengthening current regional and international partnerships. The Fijian government firmly believes that in order to combat and ultimately defeat national security threats, a whole-of-nation approach is required to ensure that Fiji remains safe, secure, stable, and prosperous. This requires not only organizing and mobilizing the government machinery, but also ensuring that the collaboration and cooperation exist with civil society. The partnerships with civil society is seen as a critical to the success any national security exercise, as they provide intelligence and perspective on issues that are outside the government machinery, but also push the security begins with me narrative, which promotes the idea that all citizens are responsible and play a part in ensuring the safety and security of the nation. Whilst these relationships are being built and strengthened to combat and ultimately defeat COVID-19, it is also imperative that these relationships are used to conduct comprehensive analysis of the macro environment, to note any other security issues that may arise from COVID-19, both directly and indirectly. An example of this was the rise of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing in the Pacific during COVID-19. Due to COVID-19, the enforcement apparatus for fishing was grounded as the efforts of nations were focused on combating COVID-19. This allowed illegal fishing operators to continue, and in some cases accelerate, their operations quite blatantly. By some estimates, an average of about 3 million New Zealand dollars were being illegally fished from the Pacific at the height of the COVID-19. In order to combat this threat and other threats that may arise, especially from the social and economic impacts from COVID-19, a comprehensive study of the same is important in order to determine how best to allocate resources to best combat and ultimately defeat these threats. This will rely on the partnerships built during the COVID-19 exercise. However, in order to ensure that the recovery is long-lasting and nations are in the best position to meet, combat, and ultimately defeat these new security threats, building new and strengthening current regional and international partnerships is seen as a key to achieve these two outcomes. These relationships not only allow nations to secure the much-needed medical supplies needed to combat COVID-19, also allow them to begin discussions with neighbors and partners on how to begin the economic recovery process through trade and the reopening of vital industries like tourism. The required protocols around the same. An example of this partnership is the Pacific Humanitarian Pathway on COVID-19. By enabling the provisions of medical and humanitarian assistance from regional, international, and development partners in a timely, safe, effective, and equitable manner. However, for these partnerships to work and continue to work well into the future, nations must be seen as equal partners in these discussions and not felt marginalized in the discussions held or agreements reached. To conclude, the Joint Heads of Pacific Security pre-event webinar is designed to encourage dialogue, share best practices, and promote Pacific partnerships, given that our security is at stake. It is also important to note that ideas and best practices shared in this workshop is not a one-size-fits-all remedy, taking into consideration the context and national interests in place. Nonetheless, it can be tailor-made to suit national needs, and this forum will serve as a creative platform that fosters the very sort of concerted approach that the respective governments and relevant stakeholders may need. Once again, I welcome all of you to these fruitful discussions and collaboration. Thank you for your resilience in this shared commitment that we have in the continued rehabilitation and recovery effort from the devastating impacts of COVID-19. Vinagwalevu, and thank you.
I know that the Major General has worked with us in the past in Fiji, and he has this strong commitment, and I think his words would have reflected that, on sectors coming together to work collaboratively. And indeed, he has been responsible for the initiation in Fiji of a number of multi-agency collaborations to think about security and the way forward in the Pacific. So this is something that he's played a key role of at home, and then through his international work, which has really highlighted a commitment to multi-agency engagement. But we'll continue on now with our 3 case studies, which will go to this topic of how we work together. And we'll be looking at Pacific humanitarian pathways, illegal human movements, and disruption of counterfeit and illegal goods. As Jay mentioned during the presentation, please do put insights that you have relevant to what the speakers are saying in the chat function, or indeed, if you have questions, put it in as well. We do have a little team here at the college who will be looking at what's coming through on that chat box. And while the presenters have much to offer us, we do also want to capture that of our people who are participating because of the depth of their expertise. So we're going to begin with our first case study, which will be on the Pacific humanitarian pathway on COVID-19. And this presentation will be given by Richard Brennan, who is the head of the Secretariat of the Oceania Customs Organization, has a distinguished career of over 30 years in policing and customs, so I think he'll be familiar to many of you. Certainly, he's played a leadership role both in the college but in the region, and a strong voice for the value of collaboration across regional agencies and the importance of information sharing and institutional integration. Richard will be attending the JHOPS and has attended many before this year's, so he'll be continuing to shape the regional security agenda, have a lot of insights to offer us, but I'm sure also will be interested in your views. So Richard will be talking about the lessons and the solutions that the Pacific humanitarian pathway on COVID has presented for us and what the lessons are for when we reopen. So Richard, over to you. Thanks.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Professor. I'm absolutely honoured to be here to participate today. And I'm just trying to sort out a share screen. You should have it there in front of you, hopefully. Right. In 2018, the Boy Declaration was signed by the Pacific Island Forum leaders in Nauru. That's a picture of them there, in the suburb of Boy in Nauru. And it was really reaffirming the Bikatawa Declaration made decades earlier for regional assistance measures. About a year and a bit later, in March 2020, COVID hit the Pacific in a big way, and the entire travel within the region stopped. There were no flights operating anywhere at that time. And shortly thereafter, about a month later, Cyclone Harold has hit Fiji, Tonga and Vanuatu, which raised the need for a regional policy towards movement of medical and humanitarian supplies against the backdrop of no regional air transport being available. Therefore, the Bikatawa Agreement was reactivated again. The first point to recognise here is that the Pacific humanitarian pathway policies absolutely respect national sovereignty, which has primacy. Hence, the policy documents are simply a set of guidance principles. It's up to each nation to use it to their advantage. It was never and can never be an impost against national legislation, but it certainly can be adopted nationally as an operating policy for people who desire, either wholly or to be in part, to effect its purpose. In some regional meetings, questions are raised as to the effectiveness of the PHP, and the commentary often reflects a misunderstanding of it being a directive. It never has been. It remains up to each nation to mould that guidance policy into their own operations at the border and into the community. From the customs lens in which I sit in, a policy already exists internationally to assist in disaster relief measures. And that's Chapter 5, Annex J of the revised Kyoto Convention, of which the customs and biosecurity policy of the PHP is heavily framed against. So this brought in an international benchmark to shape the regional guidance. And the regional agreement, certainly after some long-winded discussions, it was finally passed by the leaders. The hard part was getting the implementation at the national level, because that differed across the region with differing standards of quarantine measures. At the national level, there's certainly success stories to moving cargo and people during this pandemic, but there's also instances where things didn't go that well. As we move from response to recovery in a post-pandemic environment, it's perhaps timely to reflect on how to improve national approaches to humanitarian assistance, moving goods across the borders. And because time is of the essence, and they certainly do require immediate action at a national level. Under the PHP, as I said, there's been some really good examples of moving people and goods across borders. Initially, we saw 325 metric tonnes of cargo going into 15 nations from 45 flights, which included cyclone response measures into Fiji and Palau and Vanuatu. But as indicated previously, there are instances where disaster relief and medical supplies have been held up unnecessarily by border controls or somewhat turf disputes, for want of a term. And in one case, we saw a port authority stopping all access onto the port, so no one could get to cargo that had been offloaded. The cargo literally had to sit there for 21 days before people could access that relief. So there may be another instance. The system itself can be unwittingly let down by NGO agencies who seek to help with unsolicited donations, and they can actually flood a nation with unwanted goods or dumping. That's what we normally call it in customs. A further element that appeared initially was the level of unawareness on how the virus was transmitted. In the extreme examples that I've just provided, we saw maritime cargo sitting on a wharf for far too long. We also received comments that staff were very hesitant to clear air cargo or go near luggage, and we heard of sanitisation, saturation sprays on anything coming out of an aircraft. And that was part of an approach in dealing with the uncertainties at the time. At that point, PPE was not resourced, so the frontline officers certainly had OHS issues to deal with. The preparedness of stocking up on PPE was lacking in a number of cases, and that's reflected in what was involved in those early cargo movements. So through the PHP task force, the WHO was requested to provide a measure of education across the Pacific that corrected misunderstandings of the viral transmission, and we were able to transmit that education to our membership to alleviate some of the issues that we were finding at the ports and the airports. So the lesson, I guess, is ensure key people communicate education information in a timely manner from the onset. Another lesson, ensure you've already got enough PPE on hand for any situation that can come your way in the future. And perhaps even look at your neighbours and see how they're treating their cargoes. There were some great examples in the Melanesian archipelago of a couple of nations that were introducing some really good measures early on. And we received those, and we sent those out all across our membership through our APAN system so that people could pick up on what was really working quickly. As a measure of reflection, given where we are now with the pandemic, it's time that each nation should examine their humanitarian and general border processes during the response phase to see what can be improved. If the PHP guidelines were not being fully realised, then perhaps there's an opportunity to look at your national level legislation and see if you can bring some of those principles into national level legislation, thereby shifting that from a guidance principle into a designated process. This can include not only beefing up your legal frameworks arising from the PHP, as it should be threading through your National Disaster Act, which declares the disaster or the emergency, and that empowers the administrative elements to trigger a measure of facilitation at the border with limited interdiction. That's the key there. You do not want to stop this stuff. The sole purpose is to move that cargo or medical infrastructure quickly and to get it to where it's needed to the end user. There's certainly still a need to identify fraudulent medications that we've been picking that up across the place. The unsolicited goods need to be stopped and the dumping that goes on. And even expired medications have also been picked up. So the risk management, it still has to overlay itself into that process to ensure that the borders are fully protected. The register of an NGO is perhaps one of the most critical things that can come out of this. You can set yourself up in the preparedness phase by having a register of donors that will be able to supply you with what you need when you need it, as opposed to calling for help and people coming in from all angles giving you what you really don't want, because that actually went on. Technology is there to assist in your activities. The evolving trade facilitation modules in cargo and passenger controls are seeing a new horizon appearing with the rollout of the Asakuta system into customs agencies across the Pacific. This is an international system used in 178 countries, I believe. It's got a dedicated application that they've trialled in real life events in Africa. It's called ASIRES, and it's specific to moving disaster response goods in a very fast manner without interdiction by border agencies, but it does require that NGO registry I was just talking about. So that's food for thought. In a post-COVID environment, as we move into a more familiar flow of cargo, both from air and maritime sources, the virus is still going to be there. So PPE is probably going to be with us for some time at the front line, and that has to be thought about. The issue of regional disasters are still going to be there. I think we've got 4 on the radar this year that are predicted to happen in terms of cyclones, particularly in those nations that are susceptible to disasters and fires, volcanoes, tidal waves, water shortages, and virus outbreaks. You'll recall Samoa had a measles outbreak just before the world heard of COVID-19. And then Vanuatu got the double whammy with Tropical Cyclone Harold and COVID-19. So whilst nations often seek bilateral assistance during disasters, the PHP has a role to play in ensuring that response and recovery mechanisms during these national disasters enable supplies from international agencies from all around the world, and including the link between the WHO and the PHC task force was very strong during this pandemic, and I think was one of the strengths to come out, as was the way that was able to put the economical, logistical supply chain into play. A number of nations required equipment very early on in the pandemic, and working with the task force and the WHO together, they were able to bring in one aircraft that did an island hop, and that kept the costs down. So there was an economic advantage through the PHP that probably wasn't realised from the outset, certainly not in the discussions I sat in, but it became evident when that island hop actually dropped off a lot of supplies into a number of nations in one go. It's imperative that we support our economic recovery. That's at the forefront of everyone's thinking. And whilst facilitating trade in goods and services, including the movement of skilled medical practitioners into the region, will once again become commonplace in our economic recovery. It must take place against the spectre of COVID still being there. So we're going to have issues moving forward. They should be limited due to the rollout of the vaccine, but the pre-arrival information is vital to frontline agencies moving forward. This is not something that was given priority during pre-COVID times, but has been highlighted by a number of regional agencies that have used pre-arrival information in dealing with COVID. They were able to then track movements of maritime vessels 21 days before they came to a nation, and that enabled them to limit the quarantine periods down a bit lower from some of the times that they were having to stand off before they could come into the port. So once we resume to normal functioning, detection of COVID in the tourism and business sector will certainly trigger a measured response, at a national level, and this may require small periods of industry shutdowns or people isolations that will become part of moving forward in daily life. And we believe that the PHP, through the great work of PIS, and I cannot salute them enough for what they did in the early stages of pulling this all together, would be able to provide a relative measure of regional security to the Pacific. So the only questions I really leave you with, do you have the right level of resourcing to do what you need to do? And are your business continuity plans up to speed? Because a lot of people had to change the way they were doing things. With that, I say thank you very much for listening to me. And I think that slide there tells you what it's all about. Your hands are your actions, and it's in their future. So with that, I'll hand back over to Meg. Thank you.
Thanks, that's great, Richard. I am going to just do one follow-up, and it's come up in the message, and it certainly was on my mind that the PHP was essentially a humanitarian operation, but are there future lessons and opportunities for commercial trade when that opens up, whether that's to do with how customs clearances got streamlined, how goods were moved? So is there, one or two core lessons more for economic recovery that you would like to just highlight for people to think about when they go into their breakout groups?
I think the biggest lesson here is technology, because it already exists. There are a number of international standards that exist out there to move all the communication equipment that has to come through during a disaster, to move all the medical supplies that have to come in. And there's a process to stop unwanted and solicited goods. That, to me, is probably what we need to adopt moving forward. In terms of helping the economy, the technology, the Asacuta computer program really does have a lot of solid answers for all the ills in trade facilitation that the region faces at the moment. A lot of people actually lack a customs database within the Pacific. If we can bed that down, and we are certainly working towards that, we'll be in a lot better place moving forward to help industry to drive economic recovery, and that should flow through to the disaster management that we're after, where we simplify and streamline the movement of supplies across the border during a disaster.
Thanks, Richard. And I think that's an important point. And I know even the new Secretary General has really emphasized the importance of harnessing technology, not only for the benefit of the environment and climate change, but for the development of our people and economic purposes as well. So that's something we can think about in the breakouts. I think we can move on now to our second case study, which is about criminal movements across borders and human trafficking. And it's with great pleasure that I can introduce Jose Suso Santos, who is an expert in this field, but we're very honored to have him as a Pacific Policy Fellow at the college and helping us to learn about these issues. His area of expertise and research is transnational crime and regional security, as well as how non-state actors affect these kind of issues. Jose has also a depth of experience and probably familiar to many of you. He's served as in the Australian Defence Forces, has been on numerous committees, is regular on the media about the importance of dealing with transnational crime, and of course is also a founder and managing director of the Strategic Group, who provides advice and guidance on these issues. He is also a panel member of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Crime. So he brings a wealth of insights and knowledge to us while he addresses his topic of the risks of people movement and migration as borders open, and the opportunities we have to control these unwanted movements without stifling opportunities for development. So Jose, I hand over to you and really look forward to your comments and insights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meg, and thank you very much for having me this morning. Kia ora koutou, dear Kalai, and good morning. It's a pleasure to join you all from New Zealand, and I'm looking forward to this tala noa brought together by the Pacific Security College. on the challenges that we face in the region with reopening national borders. My comments today are going to focus on what we have termed criminals at the borders. Essentially, the risks posed at national borders by criminal actors and transnational criminal organizations. These risks are particularly potent in the Pacific region, where the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has had a significant impact on human security, in addition to public health, severely impacting economies. The reopening of borders brings a set of not new, but intensified challenges. The COVID-19 pandemic has created a vulnerable landscape in the Pacific Islands, which transnational criminal organizations and local criminal actors have been quick to capitalize on. As economies have faltered, criminal actors have and will continue to take advantage of the vacuum with significant implications for human security. One of the major features of the Pacific security environment, increasingly visible over the last 5 years, is the rising sophistication, range, and number of transnational and local organized crime actors operating within the region. This has led to the growth of illicit shadow economies, the power structures which have responded to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic by adapting with the aim of profiting from it. Criminal groups have long used the aftermath of humanitarian emergencies to strengthen their ties with communities and build greater leverage with local governments. The pandemic is no different. This will continue to intensify once the borders are reopened. To illustrate, I'm going to draw on some trends which we are witnessing in other regions. I'm primarily drawing on trends from Southeast Asia, where the nexus between COVID-19 and transnational crime were captured in last month's ASEAN Declaration on combating transnational crime post-COVID-19 pandemic, which called for the strengthening of border management cooperation to prevent criminal groups from taking advantage of the pandemic, particularly to combat illicit drug trafficking, trafficking in persons, smuggling of goods, people and weapons, as well as forgeries of identification, health certificates and travel documents, which we know is already happening in the Pacific. What is clear is that borders are under pressure in a post-COVID world, and I'd like to just bring 3 trends from Southeast Asia, which are the first trend, which concerned those groups which are already vulnerable to sexual exploitation and trafficking. Trends show that this disproportionate impact on human trafficking on women and girls, which had already increased during the pandemic, has worsened after borders reopened. Moreover, the vulnerability of irregular migrants to trafficking has also been heightened. The second trend seen in Southeast Asia, evident in research conducted by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, Regional Office for Southeast Asia and Pacific, concerns the role that corruption plays as a key facilitator for the trafficking and smuggling of vulnerable women, girls, and irregular migrants. This is not a new trend, it is an existing trend, which is intensified as a consequence of the economic and social impact of the pandemic. Moreover, the vectors for corruption have become more complex and increasingly harder to combat. While there is significant evidence of corruption as a facilitator of smuggling of migrants and trafficking in persons, it's the true extent and impact remains under researched. There is a lack of official reporting and systematic data collection. The third trend witnessed in Southeast Asia is that transnational criminal actors and organizations have adapted in inventive ways to the pandemic faster than law enforcement has been able to respond. This again is not new to anyone here today, but it simply reinforces the need to strengthen capabilities to deepen cooperation and collaboration. Why have I used Southeast Asia as an example? Because Southeast Asia has reopened its borders sooner than the Pacific. And a lot of the issues that we are seeing with the reopening of the borders in Southeast Asia, although to a larger extent, we are expecting to see also in the Pacific. There are several challenges the Pacific will face with the reopening of maritime land borders. And I could speak for hours on this, as Meg knows, but I've promised to only choose a small number of them. And what I would like to talk about is how some which are interconnected. And one that people don't normally think about is the rise, what we'll see is the rise of the number of pleasure craft that will be moving back into the Pacific. And we haven't seen this, we've seen a drop in the number of pleasure craft in the Pacific during the pandemic. With the rise of pleasure craft, there will be a facilitation and there'll be a capability to move both women and children to be trafficked out of the Pacific to Southeast Asia, to the Americas, to Australia, New Zealand, either as cheap labor or for the sexual trade, or for underage sex trade. Again, we've seen these trends in Southeast Asia. We've seen these trends in the Caribbean, and it's also linked to what we have to be aware of in the Pacific, which is, what is termed as sex tourism. We're currently in the Pacific. We have Pacific Island countries which are under economic duress, and we have communities which are under economic duress. So they are vulnerable to be targeted by these international criminal syndicates to be able to exploit and to profit from this what they see as a resource. There is also the issue that I'd like to maybe dig into as well is the criminal deportations from New Zealand, Australia, and the United States, and how that will impact as well. And it's all connected to human trafficking and immigration, and the impact that has on Pacific Island countries itself, and mainly because of the skill sets and connections that these deportees bring to the Pacific. By having these connections to Australia, New Zealand, to the US, these deportees strengthen these lines of human trafficking. Where normally we've seen deportees involved in facilitation of drug smuggling, with the possibility and the greater possibility of funds be able to be made by human trafficking, you will see their involvement in this area of criminal activity. So I'll give you just a quick rundown of just how this this aspect of the criminal deportations can actually impact the Pacific. For example, US deportations to the Marshall Islands were due to hit record numbers in 2020, despite border restrictions, with at least 33 Marshallese in detention, awaiting the opening of borders for deportation. The Marshall Islands Attorney General, Richard Dixon, said US authorities had requested the 33 be given an exemption to return to the Marshalls, but local authorities informed the US that the border remained closed until further notice because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, with the reopening of the borders, all those 33 will be deported to the Marshall Islands in one block. And that is a real risk to for such a country with such a small population. In the case of New Zealand, since the border closure, 32 people were due to be deported to the Pacific, with the majority for violent offences. Between April 20 and March 2021, 18 people were deported to Tonga and Samoa alone. As of July 30, 2021, only 3 of the 32 were actually deported. With the reopening of the borders, that's a block of 32 that would then be deported to the Pacific, where you normally would see a small number being sent over a period of time, which would make it easier for these for Pacific societies to absorb and to be able to also mitigate any threats that might come with having criminal deportees being brought back into the countries. It is likely that when these deportations begin again, that large numbers of deportees will be returned to their countries of origin. To deport such a high number of deportees will only put countries that are already under duress at further risk. The criminal deportee policies of Australia, New Zealand, and the United States have already been identified as a significant contributor to the growth of international crime in the Pacific. We must also look, and I'll just quickly touch on this before I go into conclusions, and I know I've said this before to Megan, but I promise that this time I will stick to my time. And there are the issue of the trafficking of sex workers from China and Southeast Asia to the Pacific, With the closing of the borders, we have seen a stop on that, on the movement of sex workers from Southeast Asia, from China to the Pacific. And we've actually seen a lot of the sex workers which have been trafficked stuck in the Pacific themselves without a means of making money. And they're almost like indentured labor. They're kept in their own compounds. So there'll be a changeover as that happens. And that's something that immigration law enforcement has to be aware of, as that there'll be a stronger involvement from transnational criminal syndicates. And it's also a good opportunity for us to be able to map these transnational criminal activities, syndicates activities, as they will try to move these groups of women and move out the previous group of women. And of course, I cannot. Another point as well is which is not talked about is the existence of visa brokers in the Pacific. Now, visa brokers normally assist in Pacific Island workers getting visas to or contracts to work in Australia or New Zealand. But with the opening of the borders, and with, again, having communities and people under economic duress, these visa brokers, which a lot of them are not regulated, and with their contacts, will be able to take advantage of and facilitate the smuggling of or trafficking of people to Australia, New Zealand, and other countries. And this, again, it's not a trend which we're just expecting in the Pacific because of it's going to be endemic just to that area. But it's also something that we've seen in Southeast Asia. It's also something that we've seen in South America and in the Caribbean, for example, in Haiti, post the disasters. I'll just go to collective solutions, and so that I'll wrap this up. Last, I will offer some thoughts on strengthening the region's ability to respond to the risks posed by reopening of the borders. The chair on the Pacific Immigration Development Community, Tuvalu, stated in August this year that adopting a region-oriented approach was critical to addressing the immigration issues Pacific Island nationals face abroad. This is equally critical when addressing the risks posed by criminal actors at borders. Collective solutions are therefore essential. This starts with regional architecture, for example, strengthening platforms for information exchange and coordinating investigations between Pacific states. Increased training, improving the collection of statistics on trafficking in persons for analytical purposes, developing new modalities to promote practical cooperation between Pacific law enforcement agencies and build trust as well as enhance capacity and capability. One of the biggest challenges across many sectors in the Pacific is the lack of data. This has been particularly true in the context of illicit activities, where data-driven responses is critical. To conclude, trends from other regions such as Southeast Asia and South America illustrate that reopening borders intensifies and increases existing criminal trends such as human trafficking and amplifies criminal dynamics such as corruption. As a key facilitator at the border, this has significant consequences for the state. There is a window of opportunity now to put in place mechanisms to combat the risks posed by reopening the Pacific's borders, but this is dependent on two factors. One is strengthening trust between Pacific states and between the Pacific and its partners. The second factor is that initiatives must need to be locally owned, but also must be created in a true partnership where trust is created between its traditional partners and the Pacific in itself. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to the discussion. I hope that I stuck to my time. Nick?
I think so. I just get so interested in what you're saying, Jose, I forget to look at the time. So I just get the team to do that. And I think there's been some great points for the breakout groups to consider in terms of, is data adequate? Of course, generating data takes resources and time. So we have to be very clear if we want more data, what that data is. So that would be interesting if people who are participating have views on that. I think you've raised a really important issue about deportees and how that is best managed and whether we need better facilities for reintegration if indeed this practice is to continue, and the importance of locally owned solutions that's externally supportive. I think behind your comments are also some really important thoughts that people can pick up in the breakout group about, do we need to expand and strengthen labor protections and standards and make sure our efforts are targeting on the people smugglers or the traffickers rather than, you know, too much on the victims themselves who need to be supported in some ways because they've been exploited. So I think some great points there that we can think about going into the breakout room. I'd also encourage people just to keep an eye and maybe keep skimming the chat area, because we're getting some interesting summaries, but also some interesting comments that people might want to pick up in the breakout rooms. I'm going to keep going to make sure we have adequate time to have those discussions. So I'd like to go on to the third case study, which is looking at counterfeit and illicit goods. And I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Mr. Jose Mafnas, who is the Director of Customs for the Northern Mariana Islands, and so brings the insights from the Northern Pacific. But Jose has had an immense amount of experience and probably is known to many of you in customs for over 3 decades across the region. He's had extensive experience in managing the movement of goods across borders, but has also contributed a lot to the critical dialogues across the region about this topic, and indeed at international conferences as well. So he too brings the insights from the North Pacific, from the whole of region and internationally. So I'd like to invite him to provide his thoughts on strengths and weaknesses of Pacific Island countries in identifying the movement of illicit or counterfeit goods across borders, and importantly, how we can best strengthen systems when borders do open up. So Mr. Jose Mafnas? Jose, I did it. Mr. Jose Mafnas.
Jose.
Jose.
Hi,
Jose,
half
it's
a
your
day.
turn.
Okay, half a day. Thank you, Professor, for that kind introduction, and half a day to all who are online on this forum. Before I guess, delve into the main subject of my presentation, I'm going to try to be on my allotted time at 13.5 seconds, 13 minutes, 5 seconds. But let me just give a little info of the Northern Mariana Islands. We have 14 to 15 islands. I say 14, that depends on whether it's high tide or low tide. If it's high tide, it's 14. 14, if it's low tide, it's 15. So there's one rock that's sticking out of the water, so we're counting that as an island. I know the topic to discuss, it's about the illicit goods movement here in the North Pacific, but I'm going to focus particularly in the Northern Mariana Islands. And I'm going to focus more on the counterfeits or IPR infringements, because that is a new, we just took that up, the approach to strictly enforce IPR infringement or counterfeit goods coming into our islands. But before I touch on that, I would just want to, for everyone's information, other illicit goods, the drug of choice in the Sinamay is still crystal meth. We do had a pandemic back in 2003 and back. It was out of control. The price per gram back then was $50. We did a lot of changes in our practices, and now it's $600 per gram, according to the Drug Task Force. So I think we're making a full impact against illicit movement into the CNMI. Other drugs that we did try to intercept is cocaine, ecstasy, marijuana, weapons. So those are just, I guess they're trying to test the market for it, but we are catching them as they come in. We talk about the COVID, I know that there was a suspension of flights and vessel movement into the CNMI because of the pandemic, the COVID issue. So within that standstill period or silent period, customs, we we took that opportunity to do look into our practices, identify gaps on our practices, so that we can improve just in case we reopen again, or when we reopen our borders or ports. The ports now is open. There are flights that are begin to come in from Asian countries. Now a lot from, of course, Guam, who is it's a hub for United Airlines, but we do have flights, 3 or 4 different flights coming in from Korea. So it's beginning to open. Vessels are coming in, shipping vessels are also coming into our territory. So I'm gonna again just touch on IPR infringements, on counterfeits, because it's only about 3 years ago that we are taking a serious approach or enforcement on counterfeit items or intercepting counterfeit goods. In the past, before that, any counterfeit goods that comes in, it's only a slap on the wrist. No wonder why importers same importers continue to bring in goods, because our penalty is very minor or almost just a slap on the wrist. But I had an opportunity to attend an IPR conferences, and I was at one conferences. I was with OCO Secretariat, Mr. Brennan Richard, and during that conference, it was an eye opening for me. It really awakened me, or to take take a look, or more a serious approach on infringements, IPR infringements. That's when I realized that not only handbags, apparel, shoes, and all those stuff are counterfeited, but I also learned that cosmetics, toiletries, like shampoos, that was also a part of, and it awakened me and helped me to realize that it has an ill effects to our country, economy, health, reputation, because CNMI relies on tourism. CNMI relies on 99.9% of goods sold on the market are imported. We import goods from Mercedes-Benz to toothpicks. Everything is imported. And so with that 2 conferences, after I came back, and we started making a lot of changes, making more proactive approach against counterfeit goods. So with that, we established a unit within our forces. We have 110 officers in the force. So we established about 3 officers on that unit just to strictly focus on IPR infringements or counterfeit goods. The penalty for it now, we have a law enacted. It's the penalty for it is 100%. The penalty, monetary wise, is 100% of the value of the goods. For example, if we intercept or discovered, say, a Prada handbag, and the retail value at duty free for that Prada handbag is $300, the penalty for that is $300. The highest penalty that we successful in penalizing an importer that brought in a counterfeit goods was like about $80,000 US, which the importer paid. He doesn't want to go to court, and so he paid the fines. This law, though, helped us a lot because it curtailed customs violations. It's not only for counterfeit goods, but for under declaration of goods, undervalued of goods. If we during our investigation find that it was intentionally trying to be smuggled in, so that, again, the penalty for that is 100% of the value of the goods, and it's really helping us a lot because it really curtailed and counterfeit goods from coming in. The COVID period too, we know that before the COVID, we were just starting with the AG's office to go after a shop here that we suspect that they are selling counterfeit. Everything in the shop, in front of the hotel, main hotels, are counterfeits. I mean, you enter that place. I went inside there. I mean, you can smell counterfeit from the main entrance. And so we, you know, in the process of going after them, COVID, the effect of close the shop, they all packed and left. So that COVID did us a favor for that. But again, the approach that we're taking against IPR infringement is very strict now. So not only that, we also continue to have online training for our units or our officers regarding counterfeits, determining the counterfeits. And if you can see on the slides that those are so far the counterfeits that we've been intercepting. One of our dilemma though is destroying these goods. We had 1,000 Ralph Lauren polo shirts, pieces, and other name brands. We were going to incinerate it at one of the airport authorities incinerator. It's going to cost us $25,000 to incinerate it. So we still have that in our container, trying to figure out how we're going to do this. I mean, the easiest for us is to cut it into pieces, but it's a lot of man hours. You know, so we still have those stuff, even handbags, apparels, slippers, and many other name brand. We have worked to establish partnerships with the brand name product distributors. You know, there are shops here that are distributor for some of these brand names. If we do encounter something like this, we do approach them and have them get their input from them, whether it's, you know, let us know what whether this is counterfeit. We also intercepted counterfeit Rolex watches, another name brand, what do you call that, handwares or, you know, watch. So those are the stuff that we've been finding. Again, when the law was enacted to use it to penalize, all this violations, especially with counterfeit, it has curtailed zero. Again, we have not been receiving any counterfeits now. We changed also our practices. We used to do on-site inspections. When container comes in, it's taken over to their site for inspection. We ceased that. We stopped. Everything now is inspected here at the seaport. Recently, maybe three or 4 years ago, we got ourselves a big X-ray scanning machine. And so a lot of the stuff that's coming in, we scan it to ensure that nothing is hidden, any illicit goods is hidden anywhere, whether drugs. So that has helped us to, again, and also the continuing training of our officers on IPR infringement through online, through the OCO, Assistance of the Oceanic Customs Organization. That is ongoing. I think we do have on a monthly basis IPR trainings. So ongoing. So that is really helpful for us. For customs purposes, counterfeit goods, China and the Philippines are, you know, considered high risk for illicit goods, whether it's drugs or counterfeit goods. These are our main point of origin of illicit goods, whether it's drugs or counterfeit products. I think that's it. I think I'm within my 30 minutes. Thank you. So do you have a question or what?
Thank you. Yeah, no, sorry. I was just playing around with my mute button, which is always challenging for me. I just want to say that thank you very much for those comments. And I think you really highlighted that with our international partners, there's both shared responsibilities, and we have to be careful that there's not burden shifting, that more and more becomes the Pacific's problem, not only to detect, but to solve, and those partnerships are important. I wondered if you did want to just very briefly comment, Jose, on an interesting point made by Leslie Corovalala about that it's not just about controlling border movements. It's also about thinking critically about our national referral mechanisms and our interagency cooperation. So the internal mechanisms, as well as worried about the borders, but getting that inside the country, things working well, given that these are sovereign nations that are going to take leadership roles. I'm wondering if you had any quick reflections on that point, because I think it's quite a good one.
Oh, yeah, well, we do have partnership with the United States Coast Guard. For some reason, they have, I guess, contacts in dealing with counterfeits. So, when twice a year, we do have, it's called MASFO, multi-agency strike force, blah, 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 coordinated by them. So we work with all law enforcement, whether it's the local enforcement or the federal enforcement, we all work together. Here we share intel information. We join in waiting for say a vessel from China. And so we work together in doing 100% inspection on containers coming in. So we do have other partners, the United States Postal Service, DEA, HSI, a lot of federal agencies that we have an MOAs or MOUs with them. So it's not us alone, it's not customs alone. Say if we need to get in touch with the brand name holder, we usually go to one of this agency to assist us, and we have been assisted very well in the past. I hope I answer your question.
Yeah, no,
Professor.
That's great. And I think every country has unique circumstances of the kind of bodies they're going to have to integrate and include. I would like to thank our speakers, Richard Brennan, Jose Suso Santos, and Jose Mafnis. The comments from the Major General will be sent to you, both by email and up on our website. Our website, for those of you who have not had an opportunity to visit it, is pacificsecurity.net. And so we invite you to have a look. A special thank you to Erin McKenna. I still don't know how you can do drawings and have them ready a minute just before the deadline or at the end, and them be so comprehensive. So thank you for that. We will also have that up on our internet for everybody to have a look at. We also wish the best of luck to the delegates who are going to the JHOPS, and we look forward to hearing how that dialogue goes and how some of the issues that we've been able to raise come out in it. So to all of you, I hope you have a safe end to the year. We look forward to visiting you and being with you next year, we hope, in your own countries and doing some of these engagements in person. So thank you very much. And we look forward to working with you again in the future. So thanks also to my team, Mama Coro, Jay Caldwell, Henry Varture, Ali Gillies, and all the others. I've probably missed a few there. Calais Dugo, to just all the support we've had here. And we look forward to working you again next time around. Thank you.